The air in the emergency room was a familiar symphony of chaos. The rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, the sharp hiss of an oxygen tank, the frantic squeak of gurney wheels on polished linoleum. Dr. Lena Washington moved through it all with a practiced calm, a small island of order in a raging sea of trauma. Her hands, steady and sure, worked to stabilize the shattered leg of a construction worker who had fallen 3 stories. She was in her element, a world of precise cuts, calculated risks, and the quiet, fierce satisfaction of pulling a life back from the brink. Then the sea parted. A sudden stillness cut through the noise, a pocket of silence that was more jarring than the loudest scream. Lena didn't look up, not at first. Her focus was absolute, her world narrowed to the patient on the table and the delicate work of her hands. But she could feel it, a change in the atmospheric pressure of the room, a presence so potent it sucked the air from the space around it. When she finally did lift her gaze, she saw him. Her husband. He stood just inside the ambulance bay doors, flanked by 2 men whose stillness mirrored his own. He wore a Tom Ford suit the color of a midnight sky, tailored so exquisitely it seemed more like a second skin than fabric. It was immaculate, a stark, formal slash against the yar's backdrop of blood and sterile blue. He didn't belong here, yet he commanded the space as if he'd built it with his own hands. His eyes, cold and dark as polished obsidian, found hers across the room. There was no flicker of recognition, no hint of the sterile, silent life they shared in a Gangnam penthouse. There was only appraisal, cold, hard, and dismissive. He was not looking at his wife, he was looking at an obstacle. One of his men, a younger man with a desperate look in his eyes, rushed to his side, whispering urgently. Ji-hoon's gaze never left Lena's. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, and his men moved. They swept through the ER with a quiet, lethal efficiency, clearing a path to a trauma bay where another team was working frantically on a man bleeding out from multiple gunshot wounds. One of his soldiers. Lena finished setting the construction worker's leg and moved toward the fray, her expression unreadable. Dr. Park, the attending on shift with her, intercepted her. Dr. Washington, he said, his voice low, it's the Golden Dragon clan. That man. He's one of Kwon Ji-hoon's. I know who he is, Lena said, her voice even. She pulled on a fresh pair of gloves. What's the status on the patient in Bay 3? Multiple GSWs to the chest and abdomen. He's circling the drain. But the car accident victim in Bay 4 just went into cardiac arrest. We're coding him now.
Tria.
The brutal, necessary math of the emergency room. One life versus another. A choice made in seconds that could last a lifetime. Lena's choice was clear. The car accident victim was more salvageable. Protocol was absolute. She was about to move to Bay 4 when a hand closed around her arm. The grip was not violent, but its strength was unmistakable, a cord of steel beneath fine wool. She looked up into Ji-hoon's face. He was closer now, and she could smell the faint, clean scent of cedar and smoke that always clung to him. My man is dying, he said. His voice was a low vibration, a sound that didn't need volume to convey absolute authority. You will save him. It wasn't a request. It was an order, delivered with the casual certainty of a man who had never been disobeyed. Lena met his gaze without flinching. Your man is in the best possible hands, Mr. Kwon. But there is another patient in critical condition. My attention is required elsewhere. A flicker of something, disbelief, perhaps, crossed his features. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. You misunderstand, he said, the words clipped and precise. You will leave that patient.
You will come with me. Now.
The staff around them had frozen, a tableau of shocked faces and suspended motion. They were watching a god of the soul underworld confront their most respected trauma doctor. They were watching a storm gather. Lena slowly, deliberately, pulled her arm from his grasp. I don't misunderstand anything, she said, her professional calm a shield against his palpable menace. I am the senior doctor on this floor. I make the decisions here. And I have made my decision. She turned to walk away, to go to the patient who needed her. Ji-hoon's voice stopped her cold. "You're fired." The words dropped into the stunned silence of the ER like stones into a deep well. A collective gasp went through the nurses and residents. Dr. Park looked like he was going to be sick. Firing a doctor, especially one of Lena's caliber, was unheard of. Firing one in the middle of a shift, in front of the entire staff, was an act of brutal, public execution. Ji-hoon watched her, his expression impassive, waiting for her to crumble. He expected tears, or pleading, or outrage. He expected her to break. Lena did none of those things. She simply turned back to face him, a strange, unreadable calm settling over her features. She held his gaze for a long moment, the chaos of the ER fading into a muted backdrop for the silent war being waged between them. "You can't fire me," she said, her voice clear and steady. A cruel, thin smile touched his lips. It did not reach his eyes. "I assure you I can. I can do anything I want." "Not this," she countered. The quiet certainty in her tone was more powerful than any shout. She took a step closer to him, lowering her voice so only he could hear, though every eye in the room was still locked on them. "This hospital, Mr. Kwan, is one of the primary assets of the Washington Medical Foundation." She paused, letting the name sink in. "My foundation." His eyes narrowed slightly, the first crack in his monolithic composure. "My father transferred majority ownership to me on my 25th birthday," she continued, her voice a soft, devastating whisper. "So, you see, you can't fire me from my own hospital. And you are my husband. Perhaps we should discuss employee conduct and marital disputes at home." She watched the truth dawn on his face. The shock, raw and unguarded, was a victory more satisfying than any argument she could have won. The most powerful man in Seoul's underworld, a man who moved cities and ended lives with a single word, stood frozen in the middle of her emergency room, utterly silenced by a truth he had never bothered to learn. The silence that followed was absolute, and in it, Lena knew one thing for certain. Their cold, convenient marriage had just become dangerously real. The ride to the penthouse was a study in compressed silence. The air inside the custom Maybach was thick with unspoken words, a tangible pressure that felt heavier than the city's humidity. Ji-hoon sat opposite her, his body a rigid silhouette against the blur of Seoul's glittering nightscape. He hadn't spoken a single word since they'd left the hospital, hadn't even looked at her. He simply stared out the window, his jaw tight, his hands resting on his knees. He moved like the world owed him space, but in the confines of the car, there was nowhere for his fury to go. Lena watched him, her own composure a fragile veneer over a maelstrom of emotion. For 2 years, their marriage had been a simple, sterile contract. An alliance between his criminal empire and her father's legitimate, but globally influential, corporate one. They lived in the same opulent space, but occupied different universes. He was a creature of shadow and violence. She was a creature of science and healing. They were two parallel lines, never meant to intersect. Tonight, they had collided with the force of a head-on crash. The elevator opened directly into their penthouse, a vast, minimalist space of white marble, black steel, and floor-to-ceiling glass. It was less a home than a museum exhibit on wealth. Cold, beautiful, and utterly impersonal. Ji-hoon walked to the enormous window that overlooked the Han River, his back to her. The lights of the city spread out below them like a carpet of fallen stars. "You made a fool of me," he said finally. The words were flat, devoid of heat, which was somehow more menacing. "You did that to yourself," Lena replied, slipping off her heels by the door. "You walked into my place of work and tried to wield power you don't have." He turned then, and the cold fury in his eyes was stark. "Your place of work? I thought you were a doctor. A respectable, quiet profession. I didn't realize you were running an empire of your own." "You never asked," she shot back, the frustration of 2 years of being invisible finally breaking through her calm. "You never looked. You saw a name on a contract, a token to seal a deal with my father. Did it ever once occur to you to ask who I was? What I did?" what I owned. It was not my concern. My concern was that you remain quiet, that you draw no attention, that you stay out of my world. And what a fine job you did of that tonight, she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. Publicly firing your own wife. A masterclass in subtlety. He stalked towards her, his movements fluid and predatory. You defied me. In front of my men. In front of your staff. You undermined my authority. I upheld my oath, she countered, standing her ground as he invaded her space. There was a man dying who I had a better chance of saving. That is the only authority I answer to in that hospital. Not you. Not your pride.
Fride.
He was inches from her now, his shadow swallowing her whole. This has nothing to do with pride. It is about control. It is about order. When I give a command, it is followed. Without question. That is how I keep my people alive. That is how I keep my enemies at bay. His voice dropped, taking on a raw, haunted edge she had never heard before. The last woman who stood up to me, who thought she knew better. She paid the price for my arrogance. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. This was it. The ghost in their sterile home. The reason for his obsessive control and emotional distance. She knew the story in the vague, sanitized way one knew of such things. His former lover, an artist named Minjun, taken by a rival family years ago. A casualty of his world. An adult woman lost because of his life. He saw her as a failure, a wound that had never healed. I am not her, Lena said softly, but with a spine of steel. I am not a victim. And I am not a pawn you can hide away in this glass tower and expect to be grateful for the view. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and she saw a flicker of something other than anger in his eyes. It was a grudging respect, warring with a deep, ingrained fear. Before he could speak, a tiny, perfect red appeared on the marble wall just past her shoulder. A sniper's laser. Ji-hoon's reaction was instantaneous. There was no thought, only pure lethal instinct. One arm snaked around her waist, yanking her down, while his other hand went to the small of his back. He twisted, using his body to shield hers as they hit the floor. A heartbeat later, the panoramic window behind them exploded inwards, a deafening roar of shattering glass. They landed hard behind the massive marble kitchen island. Shards rained down around them like razor-sharp hail. Instead of screaming, Lena's mind went into clinical assessment mode. She stayed low, her breathing controlled. She was a trauma doctor. She lived with controlled chaos. The shot came from the South Tower, she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline singing in her veins. The angle is too high for a street-level shot. They have a sniper's nest. Ji-hoon was already on his phone, barking low, rapid-fire orders in Korean. He glanced at her, his eyes dark with a new, terrifying intensity. The fury was gone, replaced by a laser focus. Stay down, he commanded. He finished his call, and the silence that descended was broken only by the whisper of the wind through the shattered window. They were trapped on the cold marble floor, his body a warm, solid weight half covering hers. The scent of his cologne, cedar and smoke, filled her senses. In the midst of mortal danger, all she could register was their proximity, the hard muscle of his thigh pressed against hers, the heat of his breath near her ear. He looked down at her, his gaze sweeping over her face, checking for injury, for fear. You're not afraid, he stated. It was not a question. Fear is a luxury, she replied, her voice a little breathless. In my line of work, you assess, you act. You don't have time to be afraid. He stared at her, and for the first time since she had met him, Lena felt truly seen. Not as a wife, not as a business arrangement, but as a person. He saw the steel in her, the calm at her core that mirrored his own. A silent understanding passed between them, an intimacy forged in the crucible of a sniper's bullet. In that moment, pressed together on the floor of their broken home, their two separate worlds were no longer parallel. They were one and the same. The penthouse was compromised. They moved like ghosts through the service corridors of the building, descending into the concrete labyrinth of the underground garage. A black, armored sedan was waiting, its engine a low thrum in the subterranean quiet. They slid into the back, and the city dissolved into a blur of light and shadow as the driver sped into the night. Their destination was a safe house, a place so different from the Gangnam penthouse it felt like another planet. It was a nondescript apartment in an older, working-class neighborhood, the kind of place you could walk past 1,000 times and never notice. Inside, it was Spartan, functional, and brutally clean. There was no art on the walls, no plush furniture. Just the bare essentials for survival. The illusion of their separate lives, maintained so carefully in the glass tower, was shattered. Here, there was no room for distance. Ji-hoon's men, grim-faced and silent, secured the perimeter. Lena stood in the center of the small living room, feeling the last of her adrenaline ebb away, leaving a profound exhaustion in its wake. "The Choi family," Ji-hoon said, breaking the silence. He was stripping off his suit jacket, revealing the custom leather holster strapped to his torso. "They've grown bold. The man in your ER was one of theirs. A message." "And the sniper?" Lena asked, her arms crossed over her chest. "An escalation." He placed his weapon on the small kitchen table with a heavy, definitive click. "They know our marriage is an arrangement. They see you as a vulnerability. A soft target." He was wrong. She knew it, and after tonight he was beginning to know it too. But the danger was real. The war had come to their doorstep. It found them again less than an hour later. The attack was not subtle this time. No sniper from a distance. The door to the apartment splintered inwards with a deafening crash. Men in dark clothing poured into the room, a wave of sudden, brutal violence. Ji-hoon's men met them head-on. The small apartment became a whirlwind of motion and sound, the sickening thud of fists on flesh, guttural shouts, the sharp, metallic clang of a knife being blocked. Ji-hoon moved through the chaos with a terrifying grace. It wasn't a brawl, it was choreography. Each movement was precise, economical, and lethal. He was a surgeon of violence. Lena backed away, her mind racing, trying to find cover. One of the Choi enforcers, a large man with a brutal-looking pipe, broke through the line. He saw her, and his eyes lit up with predatory glee. He was ignoring Ji-hoon's soldiers, making a direct line for the soft target. Across the room, Ji-hoon saw it. Lena watched his face change. For a single, terrifying second, the calm, controlled mask slipped, and she saw raw, primal fear in his eyes. It was the fear of a man watching his worst nightmare repeat itself. He moved faster than she thought possible, a black blur of focused rage. He intercepted the man just as he reached her, the confrontation a brutal, close-quarters ballet that was over in seconds. The enforcer crumpled to the floor, and Ji-hoon stood over him, his chest heaving. The immediate threat was over. The attackers were subdued or dead. But the cost was high. Park, Ji-hoon's most trusted lieutenant, lay near the door, a dark, blossoming stain spreading across his abdomen. He was bleeding out. "Get him in the car," one of the men shouted. "We'll take him to a private doctor." "He won't make it," Lena said, her voice cutting through the post-fight haze. Everyone turned to look at her. "He's bleeding internally. He'll be dead in 10 minutes. She was already moving, her medical training taking over completely. "Bring him here," she commanded, pointing to the kitchen table. "Clear it off. I need clean towels, any kind of strong alcohol you have, and a sewing kit. A small one for mending clothes if you have it. And I need a knife, sterilized." Ji-hoon's men stared at her, then at him, waiting for his command. Ji-hoon looked at Park, his friend, his brother in all but blood, and then he looked at his wife. He saw no hesitation in her, only absolute, unshakable competence. He gave a sharp nod. The living room became a makeshift operating theater. Lena directed the fearsome gangsters with the same authority she used on her residents. They became her nurses, following her orders without question. She worked quickly, her hands sure and steady as she located the source of the bleeding and began the grim, necessary work of saving a life. It was a brutal, bloody procedure, performed under the dim light of a single lamp, a world away from the sterile environment of her hospital. It was morally gray, legally indefensible, and it was necessary. She was no longer just a doctor. She was an accessory, a participant. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. Hours later, Park was stable, sleeping a sedated, healing sleep on the apartment's only couch. The bodies had been removed. The broken door had been replaced. A semblance of order had been restored. Lena was at the sink, scrubbing the blood from her hands and arms, watching it swirl down the drain. She felt a presence behind her and knew it was him. He didn't speak for a long time. He just stood there, watching her. "Why did you do that?" he finally asked, his voice rough. "He would have died," she said, not turning around. "You should have let him," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You should have run when you had the chance. This is not your world, Lena." She turned off the water and finally faced him. Her eyes were exhausted but fiercely alive. "You made it my world when you put your ring on my finger. You made it my world when your enemies put a bullet through our window. And I made it my world tonight when I decided that man on the couch was my patient." He stepped closer, into the small space between the sink and the counter. He reached out, his callous thumb gently brushing a stray drop of blood from her cheekbone. His touch was so unexpectedly gentle it made her breath catch. "I thought," he began, his voice barely a whisper, a confession torn from the deepest part of him, "that keeping you at a distance would keep you safe. That my coldness was a shield for you. I was wrong." He looked into her eyes, his own dark gaze filled with a complex, painful honesty. "All I did was leave you unprotected." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something far more potent. It was an admission of failure, an acknowledgement of her strength, a realignment of their entire universe. His phone buzzed on the counter, a harsh, intrusive sound. He glanced at it, his face hardening. He showed her the screen. It was a picture message. Dr. On, the white-haired, kindly chief of staff from her hospital, a man who had been her mentor since she was an intern, was tied to a chair. He was bruised, and a gun was pressed to his temple. The text below was simple. "The doctor for the doctor. Come alone. Send her, or he dies." The Choi family had changed their tactics. They were no longer trying to get through him to get to her. They were using her world to break his. Lena knew what Ji-hoon would do. He would lock her in this room and go to war. He would tear the city apart to find Dr. On, and in the chaos, her mentor would be the first casualty. He saw the world in terms of force. She saw it in terms of strategy. And she would not let another person she cared about pay the price for his war. While he was in the other room, planning his assault with his men, Lena acted. She had noticed it earlier, a small, subtle flaw in their security, a blind spot in the building's rear fire escape, visible from the bathroom window. She slipped out, quiet as a shadow, melting into the pre-dawn darkness of the city. She was not a damsel to be rescued. She was a queen moving her own pieces on the board. She took a taxi to the designated meeting point, an abandoned fish market by the docks. The air was thick with the smell of salt and decay. She walked into the cavernous, echoing building alone, her heart a steady, determined drum against her ribs. The head of the Choi family, a man with cruel eyes and an expensive suit, was waiting for her, flanked by his men. Dr. On was there, looking terrified but unharmed. "Dr. Washington," Choi said with a smug smile, "your husband is a predictable man. He thinks with his fists. You, it seems, are more intelligent. A foolish choice to come here, but an intelligent one. Let him go," Lena said, her voice even. "Your fight is with my husband, not with him." Choi laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Your husband's weakness is you. And your weakness is this old man. We will take you both. And then, when Ji-hoon comes for you, we will end him." He gestured to one of his men, who raised a gun, pointing it not at Lena, but at Dr. On. Lena's blood ran cold. This was the end. She had miscalculated. Then, the world exploded. The high windows of the warehouse shattered as Ji-hoon's men rappelled through them. Gunfire erupted from all sides, a deafening cacophony of violence. Ji-hoon himself appeared from the shadows near the entrance, moving with that same lethal grace she'd seen in the apartment, 2 pistols in his hands. He hadn't just followed her. He had anticipated her move, trusted her intelligence, but refused to gamble with her life. He had surrounded the place before she ever stepped inside. In the ensuing chaos, Lena didn't hide. She saw an opportunity. Near her, a stack of old wooden crates filled with chemical drums for cleaning stood precariously. While the gunmen were focused on the firefight, she shoved the stack with all her might. It toppled with a tremendous crash, the drums rupturing, releasing a thick, acrid smoke that filled the warehouse in seconds. It was the cover Ji-hoon's men needed. They pressed their advantage, moving through the smoke like wraiths, neutralizing the Choi clan with brutal efficiency. Lena got to Dr. On, cutting his bonds with a piece of shattered glass. She had saved him back. When the last shot had been fired and a ringing silence fell over the market, Ji-hoon came to her. He walked through the smoke and carnage, his eyes finding hers and holding them. He wasn't angry. He wasn't relieved. He was something else entirely. He stopped in front of her, holstering his weapons. He reached out, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs stroking the dust from her cheeks. "You own a hospital," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. "You save my lieutenant's life on a kitchen table. You walk into a trap to save your friend. And you create a diversion that wins my war." He pulled her closer, until her body was flush against his, until she could feel the frantic beating of his heart, or maybe it was her own. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling deeply. "You are not a liability, Lena," he murmured against her skin. "You are an asset. You are everything." He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes, his gaze possessive, absolute. "You are mine." The words were a brand, a claim that settled deep in her soul. The cost of this night was her old life. The sterile, orderly world of Dr. Washington was gone, burned away in gunpowder and smoke. She could never go back. She was the queen of this violent, bloody kingdom now, and the man before her was her king. Sirens wailed in the distance, a sound that no longer signaled help, but merely the closing of a chapter. Ji-hoon did not let her go. His hand moved to the small of her back, a warm, possessive anchor in the cold aftermath. She looked up at him, the man who had tried to fire her, who had seen her as nothing more than a contractual obligation. Now, he looked at her as if she were the foundation of his entire empire. She had spent 2 years holding him at a distance, a dangerous complication in her controlled world. Now, she leaned into his touch. It was a conscious choice, a surrender that felt more like a victory. Her hospital was a kingdom of science and saves. His was an empire of blood and loyalty. She had believed them to be 2 different worlds, separated by an unbreachable wall. She was wrong. They were just 2 different faces of power, and tonight, under the shattered roof of a dead market, they had finally become one.